Shortly after 3 p.m. on the afternoon of July 3, 1863, from behind a small stone wall on a ridge south of the little town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Union troops watched thousands of Confederate soldiers advance toward them across an open field. Union officer Frank Aradus described the scene. More than half a mile their front extends, man touching man, rank pressing rank. The red flags wave. Their horsemen gallop up and down. The arms of 13,000 men, barrel and bayonet, gleam in the sun, a sloping forest of flashing steel. Right on they move as with one soul, in perfect order, without impediment of ditch or wall or stream, over ridge and slope, through orchard and meadow and cornfield. Magnificent, grim, irresistible. An hour later, half of the Confederate force lay dead or wounded, cut down by crossfire from massed Union guns. Because of the North's heavy weaponry, it had become suicide for unprotected troops to assault fortified positions as they had in the past, using outdated linear tactics and lines of battle. That July 3rd infantry charge was part of the three-day Battle of Gettysburg, which many historians consider the turning point of the Civil War. The Battle of Gettysburg crippled the South so badly that General Lee would never again possess sufficient forces to invade a northern state. The year 1863 had actually gone well for the South up to this point. During the first 4 days of May, the South defeated the North at the Battle of Chancellorsville, Virginia. In this battle, Lee outmaneuvered Union General Joseph Hooker and forced the Union Army to retreat. The Union's only consolation after this defeat came as a result of an accident. As Confederate General Stonewall Jackson was returning from scouting the enemy's positions on the evening of May 2nd, Confederate guards mistook Jackson and his staff for Union cavalry and opened fire. Jackson was struck in the left arm and carried from the battlefield. A surgeon amputated Jackson's arm the following day. When told of the news of his most trusted subordinate, General Lee exclaimed, "Jackson has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right." But the true loss was still to come. Jackson contracted pneumonia while recovering from the amputation and died on May 10th. The South had lost one of its most capable battlefield commanders. Despite this loss, Lee decided to press his advantage following Hooker's defeat and invade the North again as he had in 1862. He needed supplies and also hoped that an invasion of the North would force Lincoln to pull Union forces away from Vicksburg, Mississippi, then besieged by Union troops commanded by U.S. Grant. Lee also hoped that a Confederate victory on Northern soil might tip the balance of power in the Union to the pro-Southern Democrats, who would seek to end the war on terms favorable to the South. Accordingly, Lee once again marched his army north across the Potomac, through Maryland, and into Pennsylvania. The most decisive battle of the war would be fought near the small crossroads town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The town was an unlikely spot for a bloody battle, and indeed no one planned to fight there. Confederate soldiers led by General A.P. Hill, many of them barefoot, heard that there was a supply of footwear in Gettysburg and went to find it. When Hill's troops marched towards the outskirts of the town, they encountered 2 brigades of Union cavalry under the command of General John Buford. The experienced Buford ordered his men into defensive positions on the hills and ridges west of Gettysburg to slow the Confederate advance, and then he sent word to the main Union Army for support. The Union Army of the Potomac, once again under a new commander, George Gordon Meade, rushed towards the town, but the initial elements to arrive were no match for Lee's Confederates. The Union troops were beaten and driven back through the town of Gettysburg to the high ground east and south of the town known as Cemetery Ridge. Here the Union troops prepared defensive positions and prepared to hold their ground. On July 2nd, almost 90,000 Union and 75,000 Confederate troops faced each other at Gettysburg. The Confederate line occupied Seminary Ridge, just west of town, the line originally held by Buford on the first day, while the Union position was entrenched along Cemetery Ridge, east and south of the town. About 4 p.m. on July 2nd, Lee ordered General James Longstreet to attack Cemetery Ridge. Longstreet's troops advanced from Seminary Ridge and through the peach orchard and wheat field that stood between the opposing armies. Longstreet's men overran all Union troops before them until they reached a small hill at the very southern end of the Union line called Little Round Top, which stood undefended. If the Confederates gained and held this commanding position, the Union Army would be forced to retreat. As a brigade of Alabamans rushed toward Little Round Top, Union Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who had been a language professor in Maine before the war, led his regiment to meet the advancing rebels. After fending off several Confederate assaults and with nearly one-third of his regiment out of action, Chamberlain ordered his men to fix bayonets and charge downhill into the advancing Confederates. The Alabamans were so stunned by this unexpected attack that they surrendered in droves, and Longstreet's attack faltered. Chamberlain and his men succeeded in saving Little Round Top and, in fact, the entire Union position. And although the Union Army had given up some ground on other parts of the battlefield, their main line held. Despite the setback on the second day, Lee was optimistic. He believed that one more determined attack would break the Union line. Early on the afternoon of July 3rd, Lee ordered an artillery barrage on the middle of the Union position. For 2 hours, Confederate artillery pounded the Union line. When the guns fell silent, Lee once more ordered Longstreet forward. The attack was led by the Confederate division of General George Pickett and became known as Pickett's Charge. Longstreet, knowing that his men would have to advance across 1 mile of open ground just to reach the strongly defended Union positions, was not confident of success. He pleaded with Lee for an alternative plan, but Lee was adamant, and Longstreet reluctantly ordered his men forward. As the Confederate troops came within range, Union artillery opened fire. The Confederates pressed on. Longstreet's men had almost reached the Union lines when Union infantry rose from behind their defenses and unleashed a withering rifle fire on the massed Confederate lines. Devastated, the Confederate troops reeled. Although they were able to breach the Union line briefly, they could not hold the ground they gained and staggered back to their starting position on Seminary Ridge. The Union line had held, and Meade had handed Lee a stinging defeat on Northern soil. Lee gave up any hope of continuing his invasion of the North and ordered his troops to retreat across the Potomac. Meade did not press his advantage and counterattack Lee's bloody army, and the Confederates were allowed to slip back into Virginia to fight another day. The 3-day battle at Gettysburg produced staggering losses. Total casualties were more than 30% of all the forces engaged in fighting. The Union losses included 23,000 killed and wounded, while the Confederates lost over 28,000 killed and wounded. Fly-infested corpses lay everywhere in the July heat. The stench around Gettysburg was unbearable. Both armies marched away from the battlefield after the fighting and left the townspeople of Gettysburg to deal with the aftermath of the battle. Lee would continue to lead his men brilliantly in the next 2 years of the war, but neither he nor the Confederacy would ever recover from the loss at Gettysburg or the loss of Vicksburg, Mississippi, which fell the very next day. While the Union Army of the Potomac was turning back Lee's Confederates in central Pennsylvania, General Ulysses S. Grant continued his campaign in the West. Vicksburg, Mississippi was one of only 2 Confederate holdouts preventing the Union from taking complete control of the Mississippi River. In the spring of 1863, Grant sent a cavalry brigade to destroy all rail lines in central Mississippi and draw attention away from Vicksburg. While the Confederate forces were distracted, Grant was able to land infantry south of Vicksburg late on April 30th. In 18 days, Grant's Union Army had beaten several Confederate forces and captured Jackson, the capital of Mississippi. Confident of success, Grant rushed his army toward Vicksburg, but his first 2 frontal assaults on the city failed in front of the heavy Confederate fortifications there. In the last week of May, Grant settled in for a siege. He set up a steady barrage of artillery, shelling the city from his army's position to the east and from the Union ironclad gunboats in the river to the west. The residents of Vicksburg were forced to take shelter in caves that they dug out of the yellow clay hillsides near the river. During the siege, food supplies in the city ran so low that people resorted to eating rats, dogs, and mules. At last, some of the Confederate soldiers pleaded with their commander, "If you can't feed us, you'd better surrender." On July 3, 1863, the same day that Pickett's charge failed to break the Union line at Gettysburg, the Confederate commander at Vicksburg asked Grant for terms of surrender, and the city fell to Union forces on July 4th. 5 days later, Port Hudson, Louisiana, the last Confederate holdout on the Mississippi, also fell. The Confederacy was cut in two, and the Union controlled the Mississippi River. In November of 1863, a ceremony was held to dedicate a cemetery for the Union dead in Gettysburg. The first speaker was Edward Everett, a noted orator of the day. Everett delivered a flowery 2-hour-long speech. Following Everett, Abraham Lincoln stood solemnly at the podium and spoke for little more than 2 minutes. According to historian Gary Wills, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address remade America. Before the Civil War, people spoke of the United States and said, "The United States are." After Lincoln's speech, people would begin to say, "The United States is." The twin defeats at Gettysburg and Vicksburg cost the South much of its limited fighting power. The Confederacy was already low on food, shoes, uniforms, guns, and ammunition. No longer able to attack the North, it could only hold on long enough to destroy Northern morale and work toward an armistice, a ceasefire agreement based on mutual consent rather than surrender. That plan proved unlikely, however. Southern newspapers, state legislatures, and individuals began to call openly for an end to the hostilities. But after having suffered through a series of less than capable commanders when the war began, President Lincoln finally found not one, but 2 generals who would fight. As the war progressed, morale on the Confederate home front deteriorated. In 1863, Confederate Congress passed a weak resolution calling on farmers to grow fewer cash crops like cotton and tobacco and increase their production of food. Farmers resented the tax that took part of their produce and livestock, especially since many rich planters continued to cultivate cotton and tobacco, and in some cases even sold their crops to buyers in the North. Many Confederate soldiers deserted the Army after receiving letters from home about the lack of food and the shortage of farm labor to work the farms. In every southern state except South Carolina, there were soldiers who decided to turn and fight for the North. For example, 2,400 Floridians served in the Union Army. Discord in the Confederate government made it impossible for Jefferson Davis to govern effectively. Members of the Confederate Congress squabbled constantly among themselves. In South Carolina, the governor was upset when troops from his state were placed under the command of officers from another state. In 1863, North Carolinians who wanted peace held more than 100 open meetings in their state, and a similar peace movement sprang up in Georgia in early 1864. Although these movements failed, by mid-1864, Confederate officials were forced to acknowledge that active opposition to the war threatened the existence of the Confederacy as fatally as did the armies of the United States. In March 1864, President Lincoln appointed Ulysses S. Grant, the hero of the battles of Shiloh and Vicksburg, commander of all Union armies. Grant decided that he would move east and supervise military operations in Virginia against Robert E. Lee. Grant, in turn, appointed William Tecumseh Sherman as commander of the Union Military Division of the Mississippi, basically all armies in the West, and Sherman would take Grant's place there. While Grant oversaw operations against Lee in the East, Sherman would continue to prosecute the war against the Confederacy in the West. Old friends and comrades in arms, both Grant and Sherman believed in total war. They believed that it was essential to fight not only the South's armies and governments, but also its civilian population as well. They reasoned, first, that civilians produced the weapons, grew the food, and transported the goods on which the Confederate armies relied, and second, that the strength of the Southern people's will kept the war going. If the Union destroyed the South's will to fight, the Confederacy would collapse. Grant's overall strategy was to immobilize Lee's Confederate Army in Virginia while Sherman raided Georgia. Even if Grant's casualties ran twice as high as Lee's, and they did, the North had the manpower to afford the losses. The South did not. Starting in May 1864, Grant threw his troops into battle after battle, constantly pressing the Confederates back and shifting to get around Lee's army to attack the Confederate capital at Richmond. Lee had no option but to try to blunt Grant's attacks and then shift to counter his moves. The first in a series of battles took place in a heavily wooded area in Virginia known as the Wilderness, where brutal fighting was made worse when fires spread through the thick undergrowth and burned many of the wounded alive. The armies then shifted to Spotsylvania Courthouse, where in a single assault Grant lost 7,000 men in 1 hour's time. The series of battles continued with the armies fighting and then shifting south and east until they ended up at Petersburg, Virginia, which would remain under Union attack from June 1864 until April 1865. During the period of fighting from May 4th to June 18, 1864, Grant lost nearly 60,000 men, which the North could replace with volunteers and draftees conscripted from the thousands of immigrants pouring into the North. Anti-war Democrats and Northern newspapers called Grant the Butcher, but Grant continued to press his attacks. No matter what happens, he promised President Lincoln, there will be no turning back. After Sherman's army occupied the transportation city of Atlanta, Georgia on September 2, 1864, a Confederate army tried to circle around behind him and cut off his railroad supply lines. Sherman, at that point, decided to fight a different type of warfare. He abandoned his supply lines completely, something that was unheard of in warfare up to that time, and he marched his army southeast through Georgia, creating a wide path of destruction and living off the land as he went. Sherman's goal was to make the Southerners so sick of war that generations would pass away before they would again appeal to it. In mid-November, he burned most of Atlanta so that its resources could not be used to support the Confederate war effort again, and set out toward the Georgia coast in what became known as the March to the Sea. Sherman captured Savannah just before Christmas, then turned his armies north with the plan of marching into Virginia to help Grant wipe out Lee. As Sherman's army marched through South Carolina, it inflicted even more destruction than it had in Georgia because most Union troops blamed South Carolina for starting the war. Even private property was not spared. Here is where treason began, and by God, here is where it shall end, proclaimed one Union private. In contrast, when Sherman's army entered North Carolina, which had been the last Southern state to secede from the Union, Sherman's men limited their destruction to government buildings and resources that could be used to support Confederate armies. As the 1864 presidential election approached, Lincoln faced heavy opposition. Many Democrats, dismayed by the war's length, high casualty rates, and recent Union losses, joined pro-Southern party members to nominate former commander of the Army of the Potomac, George McClellan, on a platform of immediate armistice. Still resentful after having been fired by Lincoln in 1862, McClellan was delighted to run. Lincoln's other opponents, the radical Republicans, favored a harsher proposal than Lincoln's for readmitting the Confederate States to the Union. They formed a third political party and nominated John C. Fremont as their candidate. To attract Democrats, Lincoln supporters temporarily dropped the Republican name and retitled themselves the National Union Party. They also chose Andrew Johnson, a pro-Union Democrat from eastern Tennessee, as Lincoln's running mate. Lincoln was pessimistic about his chances. "I'm going to be beaten," he said in August, "and unless some great change takes place, beaten badly." Lincoln got the assistance he needed from the Union military. On August 5th, 1864, Union Admiral David G. Farragut entered Mobile Bay in Alabama and within 3 weeks shut down that major southern port. On September 2nd, 1864, Sherman telegraphed, "Atlanta is ours," after capturing that major Confederate transportation center after a series of hard-fought battles. By month's end, Fremont had dropped out of the presidential race. On October 19, 1864, Union General Philip Sheridan won a major victory over Confederate forces at Cedar Creek, Virginia, thus securing Union control of the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. These victories buoyed the North, and with the help of absentee ballots cast by Union soldiers, Lincoln won re-election. By late March 1865, it was clear that the end of the Confederacy was near. Grant and Sheridan were tightening their siege of Richmond. Sherman defeated an attempt to stop the progress of his army in a pitched three-day battle at Bentonville, North Carolina, before capturing Raleigh and preparing to continue his march north to finish the encirclement of Lee's beleaguered forces. Grant's forces finally broke through Lee's defensive lines outside of Richmond and Petersburg on April 2, 1865, and rushed westward to cut off Lee and the Confederate capital. Receiving word of the Union breakthrough, Jefferson Davis and his government abandoned Richmond, setting it afire to prevent it from falling into Northern hands. Flames destroyed some 900 buildings and damaged hundreds more. Lee and Grant met in a small village called Appomattox on April 9, 1865, to discuss terms for a ceasefire and a surrender of Lee's army. In keeping with Lincoln's wishes for an easy peace, Grant paroled Lee's men and sent them home with their personal possessions, horses, and enough food to last each man for 3 days. Officers, out of a sign of respect, were allowed to keep their sidearms. 3 weeks later, on April 26, 1865, Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston met William T. Sherman in a small farmhouse outside of Durham, North Carolina, and surrendered all Confederate forces in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida, totaling some 90,000 men. This was the largest surrender of the war. Within 2 months, all remaining Confederate resistance had collapsed. After 4 long years, at tremendous human and economic cost, the Civil War was over. Freedom for slaves was not the only legacy of the Civil War. The struggle transformed the nation's economy, its government, the conduct of warfare, and the future careers of many of its participants. In 1869, Harvard professor George Ticknor commented that since the Civil War, it does not seem to me as if I were living in the country in which I was born. The Civil War caused tremendous political, economic, technological, and social change in the United States. It also exacted a high price in the cost of human life. Decades before the war, Southern states had threatened secession when federal policies angered them. After the war, the federal government assumed supreme national authority, and no state has threatened secession again since the war. The states' rights issue did not go away. It simply led in a different direction from secession. Today's arguments about states' rights versus federal control focus on such issues as whether a state or national government should determine how to use local funds. In addition to ending the threat of secession, the war greatly increased the federal government's power. Before the Civil War, the federal government had little impact on most people's daily lives. Most citizens dealt only with their county governments. During the war, however, the federal government reached into people's pockets, taxing private incomes. It also required everyone to accept its new paper currency, the greenback. Most dramatically, the federal government tore reluctant men from their families to fight the war. After the war, U.S. citizens could no longer assume that the federal government in Washington was too far away to bother them. The Civil War had a profound impact on the nation's economy. Between 1861 and 1865, the federal government did much to help business, in part through subsidizing construction of a national railroad system. The government also passed the National Bank Act of 1863, which set up a system of federally chartered banks, set requirements for loans, and provided for banks to be inspected. These measures made banking safer for investors. The economy of the northern states boomed during the war. Northern entrepreneurs grew rich, selling war supplies to the government, and thus had money to invest in new businesses after the war. As Army recruitment created a labor shortage in the North, the sale of labor-saving agricultural tools, such as McCormick's Reaper, increased dramatically. By war's end, large-scale commercial agriculture had taken hold. On the other hand, the war devastated the South economically. It took away the South's cheap source of labor, slavery, and also wrecked most of the region's cash crop industry. It wiped out 40% of the South's livestock, destroyed much of its railroads and industrial infrastructure, and left thousands of acres of land uncultivated. The economic gap between North and South widened drastically. Before the war, Southern states held 30% of the national wealth. In 1870, they held only 12%. In 1860, Southerners earned about 70% of the Northern average. In 1870, they earned less than 40%. This economic disparity between the North and the South would not diminish until the 20th century. The human costs of the war were staggering. They affected almost every American family. Approximately 360,000 Union soldiers and 260,000 Confederate soldiers died, nearly as many as in all other American wars combined. Another 275,000 Union and 225,000 Confederate soldiers were wounded. Veterans with missing limbs became a common sight, and it was said that a Southern woman's perception of manhood was that a man was incomplete unless he bore some scars of battle. In addition, military service had occupied some 2.4 million men, nearly 10% of the nation's population of approximately 31 million, for 4 long years. It disrupted their education, their careers, and their families. The Civil War's economic costs were just as extensive. Historians estimate that the Union and Confederate governments spent a combined total of about $3.3 billion during the 4 years of war, which was more than twice what the government had spent in the previous 80 years combined. The cost did not stop when the war ended. 20 years later, interest payments on the war debt plus veterans' pensions still accounted for almost 2/3 of the federal budget. The war not only impacted the nation's economy and politics, it also changed individual lives. Perhaps the biggest change came for African Americans. The Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln had issued under his war powers, freed only those slaves who lived in the states that were behind Confederate lines and not yet under Union control. The government had to decide what to do about the border states where slavery was still legal. The president believed that the only solution would be a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery. The Republican-controlled Senate approved an amendment in the summer of 1864, but the large Democrat membership of the House of Representatives voted against approval of an amendment abolishing slavery. After Lincoln's reelection, the amendment was reintroduced in the House in January of 1865. This time, the administration convinced a few Democrats to vote in its favor by promising them jobs in the government after they left office. This time, the amendment passed with only 2 votes to spare. Spectators, many of them African American, who were allowed now to sit in the congressional galleries, burst into cheers, while Republicans on the floor shouted in triumph. By year's end, 27 states, including 8 from the South, had ratified the 13th Amendment. The U.S. Constitution now stated that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. After the war ended, those who served, Northerners and Southerners alike, had to find a new direction for their lives. Some officers continued their military careers, while others returned to civilian life. William T. Sherman remained in the Army and spent most of his time fighting Native Americans in the West. Robert E. Lee lost his home, Arlington, a plantation across the Potomac River from Washington. It had been turned into a large national cemetery for Union war dead. Lincoln became president of Washington College in Virginia, which is now known as Washington and Lee University. Lee swore renewed allegiance to the United States after the war, but Congress accidentally neglected to restore his citizenship until 1975. Still, Lee never spoke bitterly of the North or of the Union. Many veterans returned to their small towns and farms after the war, but many moved west in search of new opportunities. Others tried to turn their wartime experiences into good. The horrors that Union nurse Clara Barton witnessed during the war inspired her to spend her life helping others. In 1869, Barton went to Europe to rest and recuperate from her work, where she became involved in the activities of the International Committee of the Red Cross during the Franco-Prussian War. Upon her return to the United States, Barton helped found the American Red Cross in 1881. Whatever plans Lincoln had to reunify the nation after the war, he never got to implement them. On April 14, 1865, 5 days after Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox, Lincoln and his wife went to Ford's Theater in Washington to see a British comedy, Our American Cousin. During the play's third act, a man silently opened the unguarded doors to the presidential box. He crept up behind Lincoln, raised a pistol, and fired a shot into the president's head that struck Lincoln behind the left ear. The bullet passed through Lincoln's brain and lodged near the front of his skull after fracturing both orbital plates. The assassin, 26-year-old actor and Southern sympathizer John Wilkes Booth, then leaped from the presidential box down to the stage. In doing so, his spur caught on one of the flags draping Lincoln's box, causing Booth to land hard and break his left leg. Booth shouted the Virginia state motto, Sic Semper Tyrannis, thus always to tyrants, before limping off the stage and out of the theater. Despite his broken leg, Booth managed to escape and evade capture for 12 days. Union cavalry finally caught up with him in Virginia and surrounded him in a barn. When Booth refused to surrender, the cavalry set fire to the barn, and soon afterward a shot was heard. To this day, it is uncertain whether Booth was shot by one of the troopers or if he shot himself. His last words after being dragged out of the barn were, "Useless, useless." After Lincoln was shot, he was carried to a house across the street from the theater where he remained unconscious through the night. There was nothing the doctors could do for him. He died at 7:22 a.m. the next morning, April 15th. It was the first time a president of the United States had been assassinated. The funeral train that carried Lincoln's body from Washington to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, took 14 days to make its journey. Approximately 7 million Americans, almost one-third of the entire Union population, turned out to publicly mourn the slain leader. The Civil War had ended, slavery and secession were no more. Now the country faced two different problems: how to restore the southern states to the Union, and how to integrate approximately 4 million newly freed African Americans into national life.